As the Texas legislature is now considering removing children from the homes of parents who give the children the medication prescribed to them for the purpose for which it was prescribed, if that medication is for the purpose of gender transitioning or gender reassignment. It's Texas SB 1646. A link is in the description. I am once again focused on a gender critical. This time, it's Brian Holdsworth, who accuses the LGBTQ community of bullying him if they correct him on pronouns. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Today, we are looking at Brian Holdsworth, a self-proclaimed reinforcement for the Catholic Church. As if the Catholic Church needed such a thing, especially from an amateur. Not that I'm knocking amateurs. I myself am an amateur anti-apologist. I'm just wondering what the higher echelons of the Catholic hierarchy think of his declaration that they need him for reinforcement. But even more than that, I wonder how he would take me calling him her. Since he tells us in this video that asking someone to use the correct pronouns is a form of bullying, I'm guessing he would be okay with that. Let's take a look.
But I recently had the misfortune of watching two pundits arguing about a celebrity tell-all interview. One of the pundits was saying that many of the facts claimed in the interview are contrary to known facts that we can all research ourselves, whereas the other pundit was saying that the facts don't matter. What matters is their personal truth and their lived experience. And I keep hearing these phrases over and over again. People say things like, "This is my lived experience," or "This is my truth." And what I think they mean by that is that their own subjective perspective is more important than objective facts.
He's right that what people call life experiences are not necessarily factual. When known facts are contrary to what someone else claims to be factual, the question should be which one is right, rather than making up a way for both of them to be right, like alternative facts. My question here is, was what he heard really a known fact, or is it something that people generally believe to be factual, but we are now discovering that all or part of what we thought is wrong? Part of the scientific process is that nothing is sacred. Everything is subject to scrutiny. What we know to be true today, we might find out tomorrow that we were wrong about, or have only partially understood. But since he gives us no details on the subject matter, we can only speculate as to this point. So was the one person saying that the facts don't matter, or were they really saying that there's more data to look at? What I find odd about his claim is that most of the people who tell me that their lived experience is their truth are Christians. Ask most Christians why they started believing in God, and unless they have always believed and don't recall a beginning of their faith, most will point to a personal experience that pointed them to God. That no one else can share in that experience means that it is their personal truth. So the first thing I'm wondering is whether he himself has a personal experience that is his truth behind why he thinks God is real. I looked it up, and he does. In his video, Can You Be Good Without God?, 4 minutes in, he talks about what he believes, his subjective perspective with no objective facts from reality.
Good. But what about faith in God? Is it possible to be good without faith in God? And I would say it depends on whether or not God actually exists. If God does exist, and as Christians claim, he is the source of truth and goodness, then cutting yourself off from that source is going to severely compromise your ability to be good. As a Christian, I believe that God is love. And since love is an outward disposition that seeks the good of another, I believe that God enables everyone, Christians, theists, whatever, and non-believers, to be good.
And in his video on his conversion, he shares this life experience, which is the basis of his personal truth as to why God exists.
I was overwhelmed with peace and at the same time emotions that I had never experienced before. And truth, goodness, and beauty just washed over me. In that moment, I realized that everything had changed. My perception of the world and the relationships I had were all going to be different now, and I could not go back to the life I had been living before. So at that point, I considered myself a theist, and I committed myself to following God as best as I understood what that meant. And since I had been introduced to God in the Christian context, that was the direction, the most obvious path that I felt like I could travel down. And so I did. And
So, if the only truth that matters is the knowledge that we acquire from objective reality, from what objective reality did you get your faith? It was your personal experience, not objective reality. I'm not trying to say that the lived experience really is personal truth. Quite the contrary. I agree with him that when personal experience conflicts with reality, we should be siding with reality and not with personal experience. I'm just pointing out that he is guilty of doing exactly what he is saying one should not do.
now, this is something that philosophers have debated about from time immemorial. Is the truth merely something that we perceive apart from any actual external reality? Or is there a real external reality that we are supposed to perceive and acquire knowledge from and then adhere to?
Okay, so in his opinion, we are supposed to observe reality and acquire knowledge from processing those observations. I agree with him here. Let's see if he could stick to this.
And this is the problem with insisting that your truth or your lived experience is what matters most, because what happens when your lived experience doesn't corroborate someone else's lived experience? How?
And once again, I couldn't agree more. I get tired of all the Christians that say I was never a Christian. They say that because their book and their experience says that one cannot be a believer and then walk away from the faith, to do this indicates that you were never a believer to them, because my experience doesn't fit with their experience. So instead of learning from and processing the observation of what I give them of my experience, they just denied that I had this experience. Incidentally, this street goes both ways. I have seen atheists say that believers who claim to be former atheists could not have been real atheists if they believe now. Yes, they can. We are all convinced by what convinces us. If our convictions are overcome, we change our minds in any direction. Just because someone believed something was true but was convinced that the truth is untrue and now believes an untruth doesn't mean that they never believed in the truth. It's why there's such an explosion of information out there. It's up to us to sift truth from falsehood. I do believe that there is truth and falsehood.
If truth is just a matter of subjective preferences, then we have no business educating people in supposedly objective facts. We completely undermine the premise of education in the first place. And sadly, this kind of postmodern subjectivism is rampant in our education system. And it's a very
I would disagree here. Our education system tries to be as free as possible from subjectivity, leaning toward teaching as much objective truth as possible. I think we all know where he is going with this. He's going to claim that accepting all students for who they say they are is a subjective truth. But this isn't about education. This is about how we treat one another in a collective setting. Yes, the schools teach tolerance, but that isn't the curriculum. That isn't what we are teaching students about the outside world. That is what we are teaching students about how to behave in school. But we'll let him get there.
and it's a very poignant example of the snake eating its own tail, and it has very real negative consequences and implications for current generations that are being formed in this way of thinking. This is why objective reality, objective truth, something that is external to all of us, is so desperately necessary if we're going to function as a society. Because external
Okay, you want objective truth taught to children? Cool. So, are you petitioning the church to stop teaching the Bible in Sunday school since the stories in it contain no objective truth? Or does this observation only apply when it comes to things that you don't agree with?
Because external reality is a neutral plane upon which we can encounter each other and set aside our own selfish perspectives in the pursuit of something that is shared between us. But as soon as
So,
we start,
what is the external reality forming the neutral plane upon which we all encounter the existence of God? I defy you to find any external reality in which one can find God.
but as soon as we start disregarding external reality or what is objective in favor of our own personal preferences, then we have no way to resolve disputes when we insist on disagreeing with each other. We have no way to appeal to something that is shared between us that we can compare our own perspectives from. And at that point, the only resolution is the assertion of power. And that never.
And again, I completely agree with you. The only way the church has come up with to get people to believe in your God is through the assertion of power. First, it was the power of the state through mandated religion. Then it was the threat of hell and excommunication. The church still uses the threat of damnation to assert that God is real and you had better believe it. I have yet to encounter a church that finds truth through shared experiences and comparing perspectives, although this could be true of the Universalist Church.
And that never ends well.
An interesting observation from a person who identifies as Catholic, since the Catholic Church asserts its power both politically across the globe and within its own membership. The Catholic Church claims to be the only true church. This is their personal truth based on their subjective observation and not on any objective reality. The use and abuse of clergy power is well known. I wonder if he thinks the Catholic Church should stop trying to assert its power and just seek to find shared experiences among all the people. I doubt it. They would have to completely rewrite Catholic doctrine.
So, if we want peace in our time, we have to insist on looking to what is shared between us. We don't all share the same perspective. What we do share is what is external to everyone, which are the logically perceived facts and conclusions about what is true.
Great! Show me your logically perceived facts that show your God to be true.
So I want to offer an analogy that I think we will mostly be able to agree on, and then see if we can apply the logic of that analogy to areas where we might disagree. So imagine if I started thinking of myself as a great and accomplished intellect, and a man who is due the honor of someone who has made such accomplishments. And from this perception of myself, I conclude that it's reasonable to think of myself as a doctor of philosophy. So I start to introduce myself as Dr. Holdsworth in formal settings. I put Dr. Holdsworth on my business cards and on my email signature, and I expect everyone else to start thinking of me, if not explicitly referring to me, as Dr. Holdsworth. And every time someone failed to do so, I would consider it a personal insult or an instance of aggression or bullying. Now, I think
There is a huge difference between how one identifies and asserting a fraud. Calling yourself doctor when you haven't earned a degree isn't a matter of how you identify, it's a complete fraud. Fraud is defined by Black's Law Dictionary as a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or concealment of a material fact to induce another to act to his or her detriment. Holding yourself out as having a doctorate when you don't for the purpose of expanding your viewership or making money or inducing another to act in any form would be fraud. This isn't a matter of identity. It's a matter of fact as to whether or not you have the degree. I know you are setting this up as a claim that gender is a matter of fact. I'll let you fall into that error in a minute. But I know quite a few professors that do take it as a personal affront if a student calls them Mr. or Ms. I'm just going to use one gender throughout the rest of the video for brevity, but I do intend to include all genders. I also know professors that don't have doctorates that correct students that call them doctor instead of Mr. To address someone in other than the manner in which they prefer to be addressed is offensive, even by your example. The only issue you have here isn't really that the person wants to be addressed in this manner, the manner in which they identify, but rather that you equate gender identity to fraud. You think that everyone must conform their identity to your life experience of gender instead of looking at the objective reality that shows that they are who they say they are.
Now, I think we can all agree that the reality is the person who is insisting that everyone adopt their own subjective perspective, that's the person who's doing the bullying here. Because we have standards.
So when a professor with a doctorate asks a student to address them as doctor and not as Ms., they are bullying their students? A person who has a doctorate and wants to be addressed as doctor isn't asserting a subjective perspective. Take Dr. Jill Biden, for example. Some don't want to call her doctor as she isn't a medical doctor, but she has earned the title of doctor and is entitled to use it if she wants to. If Dr. Biden wants to be addressed as doctor, she isn't bullying anyone by asking them to respect her degree. That there is a large group of people that disagree doesn't make it so. The number of people who agree or disagree with a position doesn't make it true. That is the fallacy of appeal to popularity. Just look at the number of people that stormed the Capitol, claiming that Donald Trump won the election. That all or most within that group had this shared perception doesn't make it true, because truth is based on facts, not perception. Let's look at another example. You walk into a Bible study. Someone is standing with their back to you. You think the person is a man, and you say, "Good evening, sir." The person turns around toward you, and you see it is a woman, not a man, as you originally thought. She says, "It's ma'am, not sir." Has this woman bullied you by correcting the way that you have addressed her? She probably isn't offended, as it was likely an honest mistake. But if, now that you know she is a woman, you insist on calling her sir, would she not rightfully be offended? You are disrespecting her by refusing to recognize her gender. You know she is a woman, yet you refuse to acknowledge who she is and insist on insulting her by referring to her by male pronouns. This is bullying. This is offensive. Correcting someone who has made an honest mistake is not bullying you. Telling someone when you meet them what their pronouns are is not bullying you. It prevents you from making the honest mistake of not knowing how the other person identifies. If it was, saying, "Hello, I am Mrs. Smith," would be bullying, as it lets you know that this person identifies as female, as married, and as having the last name Smith. Let's take my example to the logical conclusion using your claim that correcting someone's pronouns is bullying. You accidentally called a woman sir, and she corrected you. You now respond, "You have no right to bully me like this. I called you sir because that was my objective perspective of reality, so I am right and you are now a man." Sorry, your mistaken perception does not change reality. Whether your mistake was one of not seeing correctly or seeing what you wanted to see, it's still a mistake. When a transgender woman says she is a woman, your perception that you think she appears male doesn't make her male any more than your mistake of seeing a cis woman as male makes her male. Both are cases of your perception being wrong. Humans have misperceptions all the time. So no, your objective observation doesn't make something true. Your perception doesn't alter reality. Your perception doesn't make your ideas into facts.
Because we have standards and systems which are neutral to all of us, which determine whether someone is worthy of that recognition.
The implication here is that in order to be recognized as a particular gender, one must be worthy of that recognition. So please tell us who is worthy of being recognized as female and who is worthy of being recognized as male. Who is worthy of being recognized as being non-binary? And by what objective observed reality did you reach this conclusion? There are many transgender people who pass. They are never recognized objectively by neutral observers as being other than how they identify. But there are also cis people who don't pass. When gender criticals start policing bathrooms, it's sometimes cis women who don't appear feminine that are told that they cannot use the female restroom and must use the male restroom. Is this your objective observed reality? Do you have a standard of how people must dress or style their hair and so on to appear sufficiently male or female in order to earn the right to use male or female pronouns? And just how does one earn this right?
A recognition that extends beyond their own personal perception, but extends out to those people who are external to that person.
So here, he seems to say that you are what other people say you are and how they perceive you. If a woman is not perceived as sufficiently feminine by the people around her, she is now a man. But a person's appearance changes from day to day. A woman that appears very feminine one day can appear masculine another, even if she doesn't identify as being non-binary. By your logic, Brian, who a woman is determined not by herself and her personal experience as a woman, but by the objective perspective of others around her. The shared experience of people who are external to her determine her gender. So by your logic, she is sometimes female and sometimes male, and she can't know who she is until she asks the people around her what she is today, as her personal experience and identity are irrelevant. The conclusion of your logic is absurd. Think he'll dig this hole any deeper?
So here we have two appeals to truth. The first is my subjective perspective, my truth, my lived experience, which has convinced me that I am due this honor. The other is the agreed upon criterion by which society determines if everyone else should honor me the way that I've chosen to honor myself. And I could look at that.
I realize he is still in his analogy of one falsely claiming to have a degree that they don't have. But since his analogy is supposed to relate to personal pronouns, his whole analogy falls flat because personal pronouns are not an honor. They are not earned. Trying to equate these doesn't work because they are not similar.
And I could look at that and say those standards are irrelevant. The objective facts about my academic accomplishments are also irrelevant and maybe even a little bit oppressive. What matters the most is that I'm able to affirm my self-perception and have everyone else also affirm it for me.
And again, education is an achievement, gender is not an achievement.
And by that, I mean that I expect everyone to reshape their thinking and their perception of what the facts are. I expect them to suppress that perception in favor of my own subjective preference. Any reasonable...
How are you being asked to suppress your objective perception? If you mistake a woman for a man, the problem isn't that the woman has made a claim about herself that is contrary to reality. Rather, you have made a mistaken perception. You are trying to claim that everything you perceive must be objective reality, and that anyone who tries to correct you when you make a mistake is bullying you. How about instead accepting that your perception is wrong and people are who they say they are? Suppose I said to you, "You don't look like a Brian. This is what a Brian is supposed to look like, and you don't look like that. You look like a Jesus." And since how you self-identify is wrong, if it doesn't match up with my perceived observation from reality, I must be right, and you are Jesus. Hello, Jesus. And you can't ask me to suppress my perception in favor of your own subjective preference of being called Brian. You haven't earned the honor of being called Brian because you don't look like a Brian. Do you see how absurd your reasoning is?
Any reasonable person would look at that and say, that's oppressive. That's one person insisting that their preference is given all the priority at the expense of everyone else's.
No, that's asking everyone to accept me for who I am, even if your personal experience causes you to perceive me as something other than what I am, because your personal experience colors your perception. When transgender people are with supportive, caring, and accepting communities, the community sees them for who they are.
I see you.
Their objective perception of themselves differs from yours because their personal experiences differ from yours. Since who a person is doesn't change depending on the people surrounding them, to claim that a person is whoever the people around them perceive them to be is just nonsense. By that standard, actors are not actors. They are the characters that they portray. And at a cosplay, you become who you appear to be. A person's appearance is not objective reality of who they are. It's just how they appear at the moment. You said at the outset,
Is the truth merely something that we perceive apart from any actual external reality? Or is there a real external reality that we are supposed to perceive and acquire knowledge from and then adhere to?
Yet here you argue that reality is whatever the people perceiving the stimuli say it is. By this definition, reality changes with the group, and there is no objective reality. Maybe some consistency in your argument would be helpful.
And in order to avoid that kind of oppressive imposition, we have to look to, again, what is shared in order to bring harmony. Truth is shared. Objective reality is shared.
Objective reality is shared, but how people perceive that reality is not always shared.
And if you can agree with that, then I think we need to continue having the difficult conversation about gender identity, because so far this conversation and this debate hasn't really happened in a meaningful way. So far, we've only seen the assertion of power and the bullying that comes with it.
Anyone that thinks that transgender people have power and are using that power to bully those outside the community has completely lost touch with any ability to perceive reality. Just look at the legislation in the United States. 43 states are currently in the process of considering anti-trans legislation. These bills range from denying girls and women the right to participate in female sports, to the denial of health care for children, to the denial of even the right to mental health counseling, and in Texas to removing children from their homes if their parents affirm them for the gender they self-identify as. Does this look like a group of people with power? Does this look like a community that is bullying you or your church? The transgender community consists of less than 1% of the population. They are not a well-understood group. This kind of bigotry that says you are who I say you are is a big part of the reason behind it. You belong to and represent a group that has wielded power, sometimes nearly absolute power, for nearly 2 millennia. Yet you claim that you are being bullied by a very small segment of the population that is fighting for their very survival. They have to fight for the right to health care. They have to fight for the right to not be disrespected in the workplace. They have to fight for the right to keep their children, as Texas wants to make being transgender a form of child abuse by claiming that this is an objective reality. And you have the gall to sit there in your comfortable room and claim that anyone who asks you to use their preferred pronouns is bullying you? When you call for an ambulance and the driver looks at you and decides he doesn't want to treat you because you don't conform to his perception of who you ought to be and drives off and leaves you to die, then come back and tell me about how bullied you are. Until then, you don't get to complain about being bullied just because they corrected you about what pronouns they use. If you are so sensitive that being told that you used an incorrect pronoun is your subjective perspective of bullying, maybe it's time for you to experience the objective reality that trans people have to face on a daily basis. Maybe the problem is that you have yet to perceive reality. Okay, I'm back. Calm down now. Back to Mr. Sensitive.
The way this is shaping up is that something that is grounded in neutral, objective facts, which is our biology and our sex, which any reasonable person can perceive and assess, has gone up for grabs as something that is to be determined by subjective perception.
Except that any reasonable person cannot perceive and access our gender. The very fact that cis people mistake gender on a daily basis proves that not anyone can just assess our gender from looking at us. This episode of Night Court from the 1980s shows that even before people started giving their pronouns, identifying a person's gender from their appearance was not always easy.
Male.
Female.
Male. Female.
Which goes to show gender is not necessarily what we look like. It's so much more than that. Science backs this up, that transgender people have brain patterns that conform to the brain patterns of the opposite gender. It isn't a matter of choice. It is who they are. That they don't look like what you think they should look like isn't their problem. It's your problem. If your God made them this way, then it's on your God for making them this way. Because the science, the objective reality we observe through repeated experiments, shows that transgender people are who they say they are. They are not who you subjectively perceive them to be.
And not only is this to be determined by subjective perception, which is an extremely unreliable way to arrive at the truth, something that the entire scientific method cries out against, but everyone else is now supposed to conform their subjective perception to the person who is asserting their identity. This is why
Did you ever once stop to even consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you can't see everything about a person in front of you? That maybe there might be things about a person that you can only know if they tell you? For example, I cannot move my torso. My spine is fused from T10 down. There are rods and screws that hold my spine rigid at all times. You can't see that from looking at me. So if your objective perspective is that I should be able to move my torso, because most people can, your perception would be wrong. If I tell you that I cannot move my torso, this is not just me asserting my subjective experience. It's also a fact that I cannot move my torso. When a trans man tells you he is a man, he is not just asserting his identity. He is telling you a fact about himself that is not necessarily readily apparent. That your perception differs doesn't make your perception right.
identity. This is why everyone is tagging their profiles and introducing themselves according to these pronouns, so that we all know what to think about them, not based on objective facts, not based on our rational perception, but merely based on what it is that they assert about themselves and what we are expected to conform our rational understanding to, whether it aligns with that perception or the objective facts or not.
Yes, people are who they say they are. You don't get to dictate who I am or who anyone else is based on how they appear to you. Your perception doesn't determine another person's identity. Imagine if you were actually right. Then who I am would vary from day to day based on the perception of the people I'm with that day. Come on, think this through, man. Don't just spout out the first thing that pops into your head and think you have done something clever here.
Now let's recap here for a second, because remember, what got us down this rabbit hole of self-determination and self-identity was the claim, the premise that what matters the most is subjective perception over objective facts. But if that's true, what right does anyone have to say that my subjective perception, especially about myself, should overrule everyone else's subjective perspective, even about me, and that what I assert to be true is what they now have to adopt in their beliefs and in their speech.
Maybe the fact that I know who I am better than everyone else.
The thing about a relationship and a society or a community which is composed of relationships is that we encounter each other with equal dignity. And if we are an egalitarian society, then we are told, and we must insist, that we have equal rights, which means that you have the right to believe what you think is true, and I have the right to believe what I think is true. This is freedom of thought and freedom of speech, which is downstream from thought, which means that nobody has the right to tell other people what to think and say so that it better conforms to what I think and say.
Telling someone how you wish to be addressed is not telling them what to think. And asking you to use my preferred pronouns doesn't force you to comply. Yes, you can be a dick and say whatever you want to say, but using offensive terms with someone who has asked you not to use offensive terms is being a dick. Like if I started calling you ma'am and referring to you by female pronouns. The first time you would assume that I made a mistake, likely because of your hair. But if you tell me you are male and I insist on saying that you are female because that is the way I perceive you, doesn't make my perception into reality. It just makes me rude, arrogant, and disrespectful.
The alternative, which is this direction we seem to be headed in, is not equality. It's a tyrannical and oppressive imposition, any way you slice it.
How about the equality of being able to have equal opportunities for housing, healthcare, employment? How about not facing the tyranny from people like you saying that you must change your identity or lose your children, or your children will lose the ability to get counseling or participate in sports? These are the real issue the transgender community faces. Your namby-pamby complaint that someone asking you to use their preferred pronouns is bullying you, calling this tyranny, is just rich when you compare the privileged position that you sit in and punch down on a small, underappreciated, marginalized segment of the population. I hope you enjoyed the ducks. Live your life.